faked in a television studio. Out of all the conspiracy theories, this is possibly the most cogent, with hard photographic evidence and motives ranging from the nebulous to the persuasive. My guests tonight swear by it. Wool has been pulled over the world's eyes for 30 years, which you'll agree is a tremendous and possibly very sinister amount of wool.
I'm David Percy. I'm a filmmaker and professional photographer and have evidence that the visual record of the Apollo moon landings was both faked and encoded with the means by which we could detect these fakes.
I'm Barry Reynolds, originally a firm believer in the moon landings, now carefully reconsidering and evaluating the evidence, both for and against.
My name's Matthew Williams. I'm a believer in the paranormal. I used to be a skeptic, but one thing I don't believe in is that NASA has told us the truth about the moon missions.
My name is Marcus Allen. It's not a matter of belief in the moon landings, it's a matter of looking at the evidence. The evidence does not support the belief that man landed on the moon.
My name is Andy Thomas, and I'm a writer and a lecturer on the paranormal. And I believe there are persuasive clues to suggest that many of the NASA photographs of the moon landings have been tampered with or even fabricated.
My name is Mary Bennett, and during my research I have found serious evidence to suggest that Apollo astronauts did not actually set foot on the lunar surface.
Maybe I can start with you, Mary. Can you explain exactly what has happened over the last 30 years? Has nobody ever landed on the moon?
I wouldn't say that nobody has ever landed on the moon. I would say that the American Apollo astronauts that we have been led to believe landed on the moon during the Apollo space program did not, could not have done. And I will be prepared to eat my hat on this one, should I be shown to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. And where does this come from? Why do you think this never happened?
Firstly, because the photographic proof and various other hard scientific facts demonstrate that with the technology available at that time, it's highly doubtful that they would have been able to do that.
So let's start at the beginning. The space shuttle took off. We also take
Yes, I
off.
must correct you. Space shuttle is recent. It was a Saturn V rocket.
Mm-hmm. So the rocket it took off. I mean, it definitely took off.
We saw it take off, and NASA has said, yes, we did.
There
go
were a
to
lot
the
of
moon.
people.
We all saw the rocket
certainly
take
left
off.
the Earth's surface,
Yes.
let's put it that way.
Yes.
So I assume that the rocket took off and then landed somewhere where nobody was looking.
Well, a scenario could be that the craft took off with the astronauts in the capsule, because if anything should happen by way of a disaster at launch, we would want to see, unfortunately, the remains of the astronauts on board. But what could happen is that the craft would take off, the capsule will go into orbit. After all, that's a tried and tested way of getting into space, but it's only very low space, it's not real space.
Well, we
It's
see
only
it going
200
a
miles
long
up.
way up.
We see it
And
going
it's
a long
one
way
shot.
out. That's right. We see it going a long way out of sight.
Is out of mind.
That's right. The capsule can then orbit, and then there is no reason at all why it shouldn't land in the Pacific until the time when allegedly they are returning from the moon, and the capsule then can be put back into orbit and dropped down. Now, what happened in between, of course, is what we're going to discuss today.
I mean, the point is that why would they want to fake it? And that's what the question people would ask. But, I mean, it was so politically important at the time to get men on the moon, to beat Russia, be the first on the moon, that really when you've got those high stakes that anything could go wrong, and there's a million things that could go wrong, and as they say, not one thing went wrong, everything went right. They were very lucky that they got there in one piece. And with those sorts of odds, would somebody have said, well, okay, we can say they went to the moon, but nobody will know. But for our purposes and for the rest of the world, we will look like the world leaders in space. But we can fake those bits, and maybe we'll do them again. Maybe they'd done them previously, but they couldn't tell people, because there's sort of certain evidence to say that they've actually been to the moon earlier as well, and that's kind of
Is there?
interesting. Yes, I mean, there's Yes, well, I mean, the Russians went and sent their probes up to the moon, the automatic
probes, certainly, yes.
Yes, and
Yes.
there was evidence that there was certain sort of structures on the moon back in those days, taken from telescopes, yes. I mean, I've been following this as you've been following this, but I mean, I don't follow the theory that they didn't go to the moon. I actually believe they did go to the moon, but I'm just exploring the possibility that possibly somebody would have said, this is very dangerous, what we ought to do is not quite send them there, bring the people back alive.
Not quite sending somebody to the moon and actually getting them on the moon. Once you've got outside the Van Allen belt, it's the same difference. They cannot survive the trip. The radiation
yes,
is
you mean the
far too
so
strong.
stories, yes. I've heard
So,
about
so
that.
once you're outside there, whether you not quite is the same as being dead.
Do we know that that's
Yes.
true for certain, that you can't survive outside the Van Allen belts without several feet of lead? I mean, is that a proven
You can't
fact?
get several feet of lead off the planet with the rocket technology
Shall we
that they had in
explain
the
actually what the
60s.
Van Allen belt is?
Yeah.
I assume that's an area somewhere over the ozone layer. Which
Yes, it's way beyond the ozone layer. It stretches between about 600 miles and many thousands of miles out into space. When we talk of the space shuttle going into orbit, this is only a few hundred miles up. It's
200
designed
between
only...
200 and 300 miles up.
That's correct,
it.
that's
That's
it.
as far as anybody goes.
But the Van Allen belt is the belt that protects us on this planet. Living on this planet is equal to being protected by about 10 meters or over 30 feet of water. That's the protection from radiation that we get walking around on the surface of this planet. Imagine being in a tin can, going through the radiation belt, which is very, very intense, and beyond the Van Allen belt, there's no protection at all. So we're going virtually naked before creation, beyond the protective belt of our planet, in a tin can and in basically a linen suit with a plastic visor.
Which we don't keep down because we want to have a
Yes.
look out.
Now, the scientific measurement of what happens to you beyond the Van Allen belt is very interesting. If you are exposed to more than 300 rems, which is the measurement they used in the 60s, you are likely to die within a few days, perhaps 40%. 500 rems and about 50% of people will be dead in a few days.
So you say it's physically impossible that anybody's ever been on the moon. It's never
You didn't
happened.
actually say that.
No, you can send anyone
But in the
or
six-
any living thing to the moon, but can, as Kennedy said that they wanted to do, can you bring them back alive? That's the question. Because if they're fried, you can get them there, perhaps. But if you have
But they've
people
all
like
been in-
Armstrong and Aldrin
Well, they've
still
all been
alive,
interviewed on TV afterwards. All of them, haven't they?
yes, yes.
So, yeah. So
Maybe
they
they
could never have
didn't-
gone up there in the first
Well,
place.
this is the
That's
conclusion
right.
one has to come to.
Maybe they didn't go as far, did they? Maybe they
And
were still
you see, the
inside
only
the
safe
protected
distance
belt.
to go is
Yes.
up to the point of the Van Allen belt,
Mm.
which is where the shuttle goes.
Well below.
Well below, in fact.
300. They
It
won't
goes only
go
halfway
higher.
there.
So where do you come from? You're a photographer, and so you looked at these photographs as a professional photographer rather
Yes.
than as somebody who was interested in conspiracy theories.
Yes, there was no conspiracy in the early days. In fact, I used to be a cinema projectionist, and in the 60s, I was running a cinema in Hampstead, the classic Hampstead. And when we landed on the moon, I put up a slide to the audience. I said, July, we put the date at the top, 20th of July, 1969, man has set foot on the moon. It's exactly what I wrote on this slide.
And did everybody in
Put
the
it, and they all
audience-
clapped and cheered, and it was up there for quite a few minutes. And it was
Did they not,
wonderful.
after a while, say, "Can we see the film now?"
Well, the film is still going. This was superimposed over the picture.
Oh, that
Really?
must have really pleased them.
exciting
And it was
moment.
wonderful. It was fun. And a lot of people watched it live on television and so forth. But because I'm also a filmmaker, I got a hold of the material that was the alleged tele-recordings of the transmissions. There are many hours, over 80 hours worth, of transmissions, allegedly from the moon. And I started comparing these photographs, which are full of holes in themselves, with the TV coverage. I think one example I could give you is of Aldrin coming down the ladder. It's quite a famous picture. In fact, there are a set of pictures. So not only do we have problems with the lighting, where we can see quite clearly that despite the fact he's coming down the ladder in the shade, he's perfectly bright, equally bright to the surface of the moon beyond him.
And Neil Armstrong wasn't standing
Well,
there
interestingly
with a
enough,
flash.
Neil Armstrong has to be standing here in order to take the picture. But when you look at the television coverage of our friend coming down the ladder, Neil Armstrong is standing somewhere else. He can't have taken that picture.
And he didn't have a flash
He
either.
had no flash and no lights. And also, the television coverage, Aldrin's coming down the ladder, and he never ever, unless I miss it, he never ever sticks his leg out like that. He comes down the ladder with 2 feet more or less next to one another at every rung. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is there are a set of pictures. When one looks at the dupe of the roll of film allegedly from Armstrong's camera, you see the hatch closed, then you see him emerging, and then you see him partly the way down. Then Armstrong decides to take a picture of the leg of the LEM, and then he decides to take a picture of the engine cowling of the LEM. Then he comes back and continues Aldrin's descent, with the camera lined up exactly in the same way as it was for the earlier pictures. And he's still not standing in the right place, and in the television coverage he doesn't move.
And we also have to say that that's very talented because you haven't got a viewfinder.
That's a very important point. This camera is a Hasselblad camera, and the back of the camera comes off with a film in it, right? And then you can change the film, or change from black and white to colour, by unclipping the back, putting in a plate, just like the old photographers used to have to protect the plate from being fogged by the light. And you don't forget, you've got these very thick gloves, and you've got to manhandle this plate.
Well, they're enormously thick.
You
aren't
can't
they?
bend
They're
your
not-
fingers in them actually because they're so pressurised that you
And
can't bend your
so
fingers.
you have a camera, and to save on weight and glass and so forth, there is no viewfinder. And there's also no exposure meter. You have a little card that says, almost like cloudy bright F11. Right? So you have to get your exposures right, despite the fact that 1 minute you're photographing an engine cowling, the next minute you're photographing somebody in the shade. Okay. Now, any photographer will see, when you look at the original colour picture of that it's lit. That's the point. Lights are used. We've even done a blow-up of the sole of the foot, and you can see the direction from which the light is coming.
So, Marcus, what David's saying is that the film and the photographs obviously were taken separately, which would seem strange in itself. Why would, even if it was faked in a television studio, why wouldn't there be somebody taking photographs as the film is being made?
It's probably unlikely that anybody at the time that the film, the TV film, the cine film, and the still films were taken, that anybody, don't forget we're talking in the summer of 1969 when these would have been done, that anybody thought that 25, 30 years later that somebody would have sat down and gone through totally unemotionally, because we're talking about one of the great events of civilization, landing on the moon. I stayed up and watched it. A lot of people watched it. We really felt proud that this had been achieved. And we didn't question it. The evidence was in front of us. There they were, the photographs. We'd heard about the moon rock that was going to be on show in the Science Museum. We'd seen the astronauts come back. We'd seen the president greet them. You don't fake something like that, do you? Of course not. This is 1969. The world got a lot more cynical since then. And
You don't think they were doing such
as Matthew says, there are reasons why it was so important for America to be seen to be successful in space. Because Russia, though Russia had beaten America into space in the first place by getting Sputnik up there, by getting the first man up there, America's pride was severely dented. Kennedy comes out with his great challenge to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. And they did it. And America was proud. America was the leading country. But now supposing during the time that they were looking at how to get a man to the moon, the scientists came to the conclusion that it was actually impossible, that there were too many obstacles to overcome within the time frame. The radiation, which I think has been overlooked as a major obstacle. Sure, you can put satellites and craft up there that are not organic. You start putting organic matter, i.e. people, up there, and you've got a completely different ballgame. Yes, you can put man up there, but you've got to have 6 foot of lead shielding, and that wasn't there. So if they then got the idea, well, we're going to have to show that we did it for political reasons, Right, now we've got these big studios, we've got Hollywood, we've got all the special effects. They had a deadline. This was the date. The rocket had gone up. They had to get there 3 days later. They had to land. They had to have the television transmissions. Then they had to come back 3 days after that. And just the fact of coming back from the moon is a major problem, major technical problem to get through the little window. It's only 40 miles wide that you have to get your spacecraft to.
Right angle.
At the right angle. If it's too shallow, it bounces off and you orbit the sun forever. If it's too steep, you burn up. Little cinders picked up out of the Pacific. Not a good idea when the president's waiting. So you've got this whole pressure to produce a convincing scenario. I believed it. At the time, most people believed it.
The main point we want to get across is that we feel that this is intentional. We don't think that this is sloppiness. We think that this work was done under the eyes or under the nose of NASA. That they would have seen the pictures. You don't think NASA is going to willingly publish this picture if they know it to be phony or if they know there's something wrong with it. They probably thought, oh, that's a good picture of Aldrin coming down the ladder. They aren't experts. You don't have a dog and bark as well. So if you've got your photographic experts taking the pictures, all that you're going to do is approve it.
And one of the photographic experts you're saying was putting in these clues, hoping that somebody like you would...
I think a possible scenario is that the team, the photographic team, and the compositors and the printers, they all realised what was going on, and they must have been party, some of them at least. Not everybody needed to know.
So deliberate that they'd actually say to the person playing Buzz Aldrin, assuming
Yes.
that isn't the real Buzz Aldrin.
Yes. Good point. I think
Stick your leg
there's
out.
no way, yes, and make sure that the lighting hitting the boot is directional, and just as with your shoe, there's a tread, and you can see by analysing the tread exactly where the light is positioned. Now,
Goodness.
that was thought through. Somebody must have thought that through.
We've been concentrating a lot on that photograph. Can we look at some of these others?
Yes. Now, this is perhaps
So,
the
I
most...
mean, I've got to say that, you know, this is so persuasive, yet it's such a...
It's difficult to take.
Yeah, it's
I
very
think that-
difficult to
that's-
take, yet
Yes,
very
it's very
persuasive.
difficult to
It's
take.
being
Now,
torn here.
You may want to look at that picture. Now, this is probably the most famous of all of the
Man on the
NASA
moon.
photographs. Man on the moon. But now look at it. Firstly,
You said if
we're
we look at
looking
his
down on
reflection, you're
him.
going to see a bunch of girls.
Yes, I think we should put to one side what's in his visor, because you could make a 2-hour program purely on that picture in his visor. Firstly, we're looking down on the astronaut very slightly. That's the first thing. Nothing to do with the lighting.
You can see the top of his head.
See the top of his head, and you can also see the top of his backpack. However, the camera that photographs any astronaut is clipped to the chest. So how can you ever be higher than 6 feet in order to look down onto the astronaut? But you need to look down onto the astronaut in this picture in order to see he's standing in a pool of light. It's rather like a follow spot in the theatre. You know, when somebody moves around the stage, this spotlight keeps them well illuminated, and you can see what is the hot area. The area where the spotlight doesn't hit is much darker. Well, it's exactly what we've got in this picture. Not only, however, is this light behind the astronaut, but the part of the astronaut that faces the camera that ought to be totally black, because we're in a vacuum, and there's no way you get anything filling in. The rocks are totally black, by the way. When we see pictures of rocks in these Apollo pictures, they're so black you can't see where the rock stops and the shadow begins. So why isn't our astronaut totally black? Well, NASA don't want that. They want to be able to see their astronaut. So what one does in a photographic studio, even in this studio one would do it if one was photographing something like a car or a pack shot of a product. You bring in your polystyrene, you bring in your reflector board, or you use another soft light, and you fill in, and you almost fight the light that's lighting from the primary source. And that's exactly what we see in this picture. In the distance, left and right, the horizon, it's very dark. It's almost a stop or two darker than our subject.
But
He's
it's supposed to be
standing in a
illuminated by
pool
the sun,
of light.
which is a
Natural
totally
sunlight, yeah.
Is this
level
how light
illumination.
behaves?
Yes, the horizon should be lit up as much as the rest of the picture. And this has not occurred to anybody.
He cannot be standing in a pool of light if he's lit by the sun. It has to be lit. That means a studio.
Unless, of course, that this was a specially prepared batch of film by Kodak.
Well, we have spoken to Kodak about this, and we
What
know
have they
that it's
said?
ordinary
Ordinary
Ektachrome,
Ektachrome.
160 ASA, as it used to be called in those days, film that anyone could buy. There was nothing special about it at all. It was 70mm
But
film with
surely
sprockets.
there must have been something special about it, because we know that on the moon's surface the temperature is extreme. It's either very hot or very cold, and if it was very hot because we're allegedly in the sunlight, the temperature is about 200 degrees centigrade. It's about the temperature you'll cook your Christmas turkey at.
Yes, if I may just comment on the temperatures, on the transmissions, and I'd like to take this as the figure that we go with, on the transmissions they talk about it being 180 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
Okay, but that's in the sun. If you leave your film stock and your camera in the shade, it will go to minus 180 degrees. Now, you try putting your film stock in the freezer, if it'll go that cold, right, and try to wind it on in your camera, right, then you take it out and then you put it in the oven, right, and then you see how the emulsion gets very soft, and it's also difficult to wind on without damaging the sprocket holes. Yet, if you look at Armstrong's roll of film, the majority of the pictures are all nicely exposed, and there are no problems with torn sprocket holes or the film becoming so brittle that it will break. None of those things have happened. It's not consistent with the pictures having been taken in that environment.
Now, Barry, what does NASA feel about these views? Are they honouring your views with an answer? Are they what are they saying?
I don't think NASA have commented yet. Quite how much of this information they're aware of, I'm not quite sure, but it would be nice to think that they could come forward and easily put a stop to some of this, because the photographic evidence in particular with these things like the hot spots of light, you can't deny that that is there on the photographs, and it just doesn't add up. And wouldn't it be very easy for somebody from NASA to step forward and say, well, the reason for that is because, and they come up with a simple answer. But with all of these books and articles that have been written, there's not one person has yet come back and been able to say, well, in actual fact, the reason for this is... They just haven't done it.
We phoned NASA to ask their opinion on this, and they said that they'd like you and everybody to know that the moon landings did take place.
I'm sure they would.
We'd sort of guessed that, pretty much so. It was somebody in public affairs.
yes.
Aren't they likely to have said anything else?
Well, I mean, no.
Of course not.
No, they wouldn't.
They couldn't
necessarily.
possibly
But I
come
find-
back and say,
No.
we've been spotted at last. Well done,
Yes,
chaps.
sorry,
You
you're
know,
But these
top of the world here.
photographs are getting more and more well known now, and your views are getting more and more well known. You'd think that they would have commented or...
Slightly differently. It's a sort of no comment, really, isn't it?
Andy, you believe that the astronauts did actually go to the moon?
I find it very hard to believe that we've never been to the moon, because it's not just the shots taken on the surface. Of course, there's lots of photographs taken in orbit or whatever. Now, I accept they could have been taken by unmanned probes, but what concerns me more is just the photographs. Putting aside everything else, the photographs clearly do not stand up to scrutiny. Now, I think, like Barry was saying, we deserve answers from NASA. Now, if these are just simply us being very, very silly, it would be the simplest thing in the world for NASA to come forward and say to us, well, this is why these pictures look like this, and it's as simple as that. Now, the fact that they've said nothing at all is very strange. But I differ from David here in terms of the whistleblower's theory, which says that there were deliberate anomalies put into the photographs so that 20, 30 years down the line we would discover them and realise it was a hoax. I actually believe it's just as likely to be down to incompetence, because nobody thought that anybody would ever question the photographs that deeply. And human nature being what it is, and who knows, maybe the hoax was conducted in a hurry or whatever, we don't know why they did it.
Certainly not.
Why do you think that?
Because the whole of the Apollo program goes back well before 1960s, and the space program, if you like, well before the 60s. So this is not something in a hurry. Now, the decision to do it will have been taken as soon as they knew that radiation is the biggest showstopper of the solar system, of our
probably
living
found by
thing,
the Russians
which
as
is in
well.
1958. They knew that.
We've touched on the problems of radiation with the astronauts, but when we put this to a very well-known astronomer who runs a planetarium in England, we discussed what we've been talking about now, and within about 10 minutes he said, "We didn't go, did we?" Because we showed him a picture of the camera, and he said, what about the X-ray problem? Now, we all remember in the old days when we had these old-fashioned X-ray machines at airports,
You'd say,
they
don't
weren't
put your
film
camera
safe.
through.
And if you were a camera crew and you've been around the world going from country to country with your film rushes, as they're called, putting them through X-ray machine after X-ray machine, you could end up with your film being very badly fogged, which means it's not correctly exposed and will never look right.
And
Now,
these photographs are perfect.
No fogging.
how
any
do you
photo.
take pictures with X-rays all around you with no protection for the camera? Now, the official explanation as to why the X-rays didn't affect the film is that the camera is very well protected. It was painted with a coat of aluminium paint. This is the
Good, isn't
X-ray
it?
protection.
Ah.
And some experts have said, you mentioned what about asking NASA, but we have asked contractors to NASA, and they said, well, it must have been all right because, look, the pictures are fine.
Was it Armstrong's voice that said one small step for man?
That's right.
Well,
But
we
where-
are told it's Armstrong's voice.
But do you think it was Armstrong's voice?
There's no reason why it
doesn't
shouldn't
make
be.
any difference whether it was or not, because he
There's
doesn't
no
have to have
reason
done it on the moon.
why it shouldn't.
Well, if we found out that it wasn't Armstrong's voice, then, then...
Well,
then
he
we're
hasn't
getting
taken
somewhere.
a sound test on it, but that
this
doesn't
is,
matter.
again, work that can be done on analysing the sound.
Where were they, do you think, at this point? Where was this television studio?
Well, I don't think we should speculate as to where it was. I don't think it matters. It could be in the Nevada desert. It could be what they've been doing in Area 51. You know, if you have got a big moon set somewhere, that would be a reason why you wouldn't want people flying over it.
Spot all these
That's
things
right.
lying around.
Don't forget the Apollo 11 studio was a very small one because they were only on the surface for a few hours, and that could be inside. But once you get to Apollo 17, where there's a vast landscape, this has to be done outside, and you need a black sky, and therefore your exterior set would have to be done at night. One of the James Bond movies, doesn't really matter which one it is, it's a scene. James Bond walks into...
Moonraker.
It could have been Moonraker, but I don't think it was. James Bond walks into a particular lab.
Dr. No.
No, it's not Dr. No. No.
We'll get it in a
Not
minute.
Dr. No.
It'll come.
It was a very good try.
Really
It doesn't matter what the movie was. It's a James Bond movie, and people say, "What's that scene doing in there?" He walks into this lab, and they're going to the moon, and he says, "I've come to inspect your radiation shields."
Yes, it does.
Okay, and the next thing he does, he walks out of the lab onto a moon set with astronauts pouncing around and phony backgrounds to it.
And a studio.
That's right, it's a
Above it.
complete studio.
I remember
at the
this
And he
scene.
ends up being chased out of this set. So
Leaping
you have a
onto the rover
connection
and rushing off.
in a James Bond movie of a lunar set and a statement just prior to it that says, "I've come to inspect your radiation shields." Now, isn't that interesting?
And these movies were made for a purpose then?
Well, certainly all movies made for a purpose. One is to entertain, two is to make a lot of money, or possibly the other way round. One is a product of the other.
But are
But
they also made for a
Yes.
slightly more sinister purpose?
I don't think James Bond is made for a sinister purpose. I think we have possibly, there's a zeitgeist in artists that they're going to pick up the general energy of what's going on, and scriptwriters who are very close to the edge of things are going to incorporate into all work, as anybody does, a painter, writer or whatever, their caring about things. And as you know, in repressive societies, you can get a lot said in fiction or in entertainment that you can't actually say straight out. And just because America is not labelled a communist society does not mean to say either that it's a democracy.
But in some cases, you can have a situation where things are done to confuse. And in the same way as you can drop in hints, as in the Bond movie we've just talked about, you've got a situation with Independence Day, which is incidentally about ETs, and I don't think
It's a
anybody
very, very
panicked
clever film.
when that film was released.
Well, that's because they weren't pretending it was actually happening.
There was a
Which
lot
they
of
did with the Orson Welles.
interesting, confusing
Well, the
information in
interesting,
it.
one of the interesting things about Independence Day is that they refer to Roswell, which occurred in the middle of 1947, and in the script of that movie, they say that Roswell occurred in the 50s. Now, I don't think this is sloppy researching. I think it's intentional confusing. There's a mixture of what has been reported, various research, and things that are actually incorrect. to confuse. So you have an opposite situation.
So do you think it is to confuse, I'm
Yes.
sorry, or do you think it's just to make it more entertaining? If the truth is
No,
perhaps a bit boring,
no.
you can spice it up.
Why is that truth is not boring to start with, as you well know? And secondly, it's to confuse people like you who don't know the history. Us oldies but goldies remember the first time round, if you like. And we have access to documents which have, as near as we can get to the first time round, but in all the magazines that are coming out now, in all the movies, even in Dark Skies, they then insinuated that the Navy was involved in the Roswell situation. The Navy was nowhere near. Probably
The
about the
Roswell
only
was a
guys
crash
who
that
were not
occurred
in the
and somebody
frame.
found the wreckage. In the Dark Skies program, this is done rather like Close Encounters of the Third Kind,
Yeah.
with everybody there
Everybody
to welcome
makes
them,
an appointment.
and then they shoot this ET craft out of the sky with what appears to be a machine gun. Now, are we supposed to believe that ET, with its fantastic scientific advancement, coming to Earth in a UFO, hasn't got any protective shield around it against the machine gun, and the whole thing crashes?
Well, of course it is fiction, but what it's causing
What
people
is
to do,
fiction?
I mean, what the programs are fiction, but there's bits of
Well,
truth
they're not
in
fiction
there.
when they're using fact. I think that we are being given information and guided in a way of thinking in order that a certain atmosphere is achieved within the general public. And
yes,
most
they
of that
want to
who-
inform.
Who is deciding?
And
what
before
should
who,
come?
let's just finish
I think
why.
the atmosphere is to create, now I think the atmosphere is to create a fear of things unknown, and especially ET. I do not think that the powers that be, whoever they might be, and Marcus, you can answer that one, you're head of
But there's a
conspiracy.
lot
Is
more
this,
of that
is,
there.
this, is this the,
Huh?
the
Information
famous
is out there.
secret one world government that we hear so much about?
Well,
The elders
as
of
to whether
Zion.
there is a secret one
Well,
world
that's
government,
really
the evidence
false.
for it is, shall we say, not exactly coming out of every newspaper and television program one reads. There is a rumour of it. There is certainly that is an explanation offered by many people for certain unexplained and unconnected events, which, by saying, well, it must be the secret one world government, whoever they are, it explains things which are inexplicable. And it is not something which I think should be encouraged, that, with all due respect, Mary, the idea that there is a manipulating force,
No,
I think
there
comes
is a
out rather...
manipulating force, but
it comes
isn't
out very
as
well in
hidden.
fiction.
No, it is not as hidden as you're saying. The manipulating force is that those who wish to maintain their status quo, and we all do this, we all wish to maintain where we're at.
Yeah.
So to a degree we all do what we need to do in order to make sure we've still got our favourite food on the table and do our favourite things. It is that on a larger scale, but the fact of the matter is, if E.T. is out there, it is not necessarily that he is a four-headed reptilian oink who can't relate to anything or anybody, but that is the impression that we are being given very much so lately in the last few years from the media and the magazines that publish this stuff, and there must be an intention behind it. And if you are running a multi-million pound company in whose interest it is to maintain your status quo at that level, then you would rather have things not change.
And are the same
Certainly,
people who are
Mhm.
destabilising us through misinformation in films and television programmes, are these the same people who are also feeding us the untruths about the moon landing? Is it the same group of people?
I would say that we are being steered by human beings in one direction, and I would say that the experiences of many, 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 many people of other forms of consciousness are steering them in another direction, and these two directions are possibly not of the same demands. And it is not E.T. or the consciousnesses that manifest as such who are the aggressive partners in that.
We're all being very mild-mannered here today, and
Yes,
I mean,
aren't we?
we have a lot to say. I mean, there is evidence. We haven't looked at all of it here. I mean, the thing is, life is easy to live if you're ignorant of certain facts. And people live their lives quite happily, not knowing some of the things that some of us here have come into contact with, the information. The information is out there. It's not necessarily suppressed. And if you look a little bit further, just beneath the surface, I mean, this is not crazy stuff. This is out there.
We started with these photographs, maybe we can end with them.
That picture is interesting for two reasons. A, you can see the lem there with nothing disturbing to the rock. and B, you can see shadows going in crazy directions.
You'd expect a dust blast or something, wouldn't you? You know,
absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
there are so many different statements about dust. You know, one mission will say, "Oh, kicking up a lot of dust." The other will say, "Oh, no dust here."
Yes.
You know,
This is another
it's
picture of the
completely
module.
all over the place. and I comment.
Have you never thought about, surely the natural progression of your investigation would be to try and find out the people who took the photographs, where the moon landing was faked, what television studio? Have you never been interested in trying to discover
Oh yes,
those
in
things?
fact, we've even been to speak to engineers who actually worked on that module. And we've got some very interesting answers, which are going to be in our book. But there is something else that anyone can test, and it's a very interesting thing to do. If anyone has an encyclopedia, like the Grolier Encyclopedia on CD-ROM, you not only see the footage, the alleged footage, of us coming down, landing on the moon, okay, but you hear Armstrong's voice saying that he's giving a countdown as to how things are progressing, mentions the phrase, picking up a little dust, and so forth, and we see the touchdown. Now, as a filmmaker, one has filmed in many places. Helicopters, Boeing 747s, even a guy piloting a bobsleigh on the San Moritz bobsleigh run.
You get a lot of
And
dust.
you cannot hear a word they say unless they shout, unless there's stress in the voice, unless there's tension. This capsule was pressurized. They weren't yet wearing their spacesuits, so they were alive, allegedly. So how are they able to say, picking up a little dust, with complete silence in the background? It's, in my view, it's more whistleblowing, because it would be easier to add the rumble. Now don't forget, he's standing over
on top of this engine.
this engine that has 10,000 pounds of thrust throbbing away. I mean, if you were to watch a rocket being
Sexy.
launched at Cape in America or in Russia or anywhere where we launch rockets, you have to stand more than a mile away. This is dangerous and noisy. If the rocket ever falls over, the blast will blast things at a tremendous rate, with tremendous force. Imagine your sofa is just above a rocket with 10,000 pounds of thrust, and you're just talking as cool as a cucumber?
He was very calm. The Eagle has landed. But he was representing America. He had to be calm. This was a big moment.
Well,
for him.
Exactly, but it's phony. It isn't real.
That he had done many hundreds of simulations. He'd spent many months, all the
Yes,
astronauts,
he spent over a year
worked in
preparing
simulators,
exhibitions.
just
on
as airline
simulators.
pilots today work in simulators. What do you do if all four engines die on you and you've got a thunder, you know. The astronauts trained in simulators. Armstrong was known to be one of the coolest pilots. He was, incidentally, Armstrong was a civilian.
No, he was not.
military.
He was not a civilian. He belongs to Edwards Air Force Base. He was flying X-15s
He
or whatever it was.
used to fly the X-15s out
He
of
was
Edwards Air
never a
Force Base.
civilian.
Have any of you ever tried to approach Neil Armstrong to talk to him about this?
We know somebody who has. He's a reporter in America, and he once went to see Neil Armstrong. He lives in a farm in the middle of nowhere. Unlike Aldrin, who has been doing the circuit for many years and endeavouring to put a brave front on all this, Armstrong won't talk to anybody. Anyway, this reporter, who's a television reporter, went along to Armstrong's place, knocked on the door, said, "Could I speak to you, please?" Armstrong said, "If you ever come back here again, you'll be physically removed from these premises." He did go back again, and he was physically removed, and he has got it on video.
And did
Now,
he say to
is
Neil
this consistent with a man who went to the moon in peace for all mankind?
Yeah.
He will not discuss it. He's given his 10 interviews over the last few years that he's obliged to give, and he will not give any more. Why can't he be courteous? Why can't he say, look, I've retired, it's all in the books? Why say to someone, allegedly, that if you return here again, you'll be forcibly removed?
Maybe he got sick of it, moon this, moon that.
Why would you get sick of something unless you're really sick of it?
Well, if it was a very small part of his life, of course.
What?
It was just, it was
It's the biggest thing that ever happened to
Absolutely.
him.
Exactly.
Would you not
Yeah.
think?
And
Yes,
and he's spending the rest of his
exactly.
life living in the shadow of it.
For one of the researchers, a journalist contacted Aldrin quite recently and said, what about all this stuff that we may not have gone to the moon? And he came out with a lot of very interesting comments, which don't answer the question at all. He could easily have said, and I think if I had been there, or if anybody else had been there, he would have said, I don't care what you have to say, I stood on the surface of the moon, I was overawed, I couldn't believe the majesty of the stars that were around me.
Well, they can't
It
say
was
that.
so moving. It was the most fantastic thing that ever happened to me. No one can ever take it away from me, and I don't care what anybody ever says. I was on the moon, and it was amazing. None of them have ever spoken in such terms. They all come out with gobbledygook that enables them to perpetuate the myth. None of them are passionate enough. None of them are acting consistently with having been where they allegedly have been.
But this does raise an interesting point, though, that we're not just talking about one mission here. No. We're talking about several missions. Now, the one question which bugs me slightly is, if you're going to hoax it, okay, you do it once. Why keep doing it again and again and risk being found out with every mission that you pretend to do? Why not just leave it at one, possibly two, and then say, okay, we've made our point. It looks like we've been to the moon. Let's leave it there. Now, why keep trying to perpetuate going to the moon? Surely that's then risking being found out.
If you look at the story of the missions, the way they work out, the events that happen on them, dare I say, script writing into each mission, you'll find that there is a cut-off point for public awareness. Apollo 12, the camera, allegedly, didn't work on the lunar surface, so it was sound only. Now you're talking about a country that lives through its television, and television at that time was a relatively new toy. So, you know, people would normally have been going, gosh, second mission to the moon, and you know, human beings, they're more interested in what's going to go wrong than what's going to go right. So if something wonderfully awful is going to happen, then they'll all be glued there. But if it's all boringly all boring, and I'm walking over here, I'm walking over there, they don't take any notice.
You don't pick up on that point that Mary has made. The report was that the television camera for Apollo 12 failed. But if you look at the footage, frame by frame, which I had the luxury of being able to do with an edit suite, you can find frames where the camera was picked up from being laid on the deck to being put somewhere else, and you can see quite clearly the camera is working. So, if this is correct, if the camera was working, and it was working when they came down the ladder, why didn't someone at Mission Control say, come on guys, put the camera on the legs, we want to see what you're doing? Never, for over half an hour, does anyone tell them to do something about this camera that isn't set up. Then, are we surprised when none of the TV networks in America wants to take Apollo 13?
They don't.
Of course they don't want to take it, because they were really bored with Apollo 12. It looks too much like script writing.
But if Apollo 12 was fake, and the cameras weren't working, why not just fake the pictures like they did the first mission if the camera wasn't working? Why say the camera wasn't working? Why not come up with pictures like they did the first time?
Well, they did.
They took photographs. Allegedly, they still went. Whatever happened, I mean, there is one possible scenario here that all these Apollo missions are a front for what might have really happened. Yeah. The shop window version.
Which is what?
Well, I don't think we've got time to go into that today, but
we
haven't. I think that's more likely. I think that's more likely than it never happened at all. That what we are presented with here, what these pictures are not the true story, but there is a true story to be told.
Yes, but we're just talking about the shop window version for the moment. Okay. Now, if you want Apollo 13 to happen, in other words, if it's part of the planned scenario, that the things will get grander and grander, but you need Apollo 13 in order to draw people's attention, you then have got to make sure that they're not particularly enamoured with 12. Okay?
Are you suggesting that the Apollo 13, the mishap was staged?
Well, everything is staged.
Yes, definitely.
Therefore, Apollo 13 was a script at the beginning, just in the same way as the movie. In fact, the movie that you see is a script. Okay, and that's what happened with Apollo 13, really. Nobody went to the moon and nearly landed and then safely got back through the narrow window that Marcus has described, using this LEM engine. No one did that, in our view.
So Apollo 13 was staged for ratings purposes?
It was staged in order, yes, for funding, because NASA is slowly finding its funding is being reduced. They wanted to go further and further and have more missions. This is the answer. If there were planned to be more missions, and if these are pictures that are just literally fronting the situation, they have to carry on doing it.
You also have to justify the funding that you have had.
Can I ask, was the Challenger explosion staged?
The explosion was real, but how it occurred is another matter.
Space shuttles do go up. They do orbit the Earth. They're in low orbit, 250 to 300 miles up.
You
There's
think
no problem
Do you
about
mean the
that at
actual
all.
event?
Yeah. What do you think it was deliberately
I don't think we
exploded?
can comment on that now, but I think there's more to it than perhaps we know.
One thing that we haven't touched on really is the reasons why you've become so fascinated in this. Not
It's
the
about
information.
integrity and truth, isn't it? And it's about the future of this planet, because although America has the biggest space agency at one point and Russia have an extremely efficient space agency, you actually have, humanity is dependent upon the integrity of those people who are exploring frontiers that most of us, can't go to at the moment. So we are dependent upon them for the quality of information and of learning about our universe. And therefore, if there's something wrong, then everybody deserves to be given the chance to make their own opinion. Because we cannot live in fear and doubt and not be able to trust the information that we're given.
And why are you the person to filter through this information?
I am not the chosen one to filter through this information. It happens to be that I have fallen upon it through other work and circumstances. Everybody's doing it. We're all doing it. You're doing it by asking the questions.
I think
But I haven't dedicated my life to it, and
I'm
you
not
people
going to
have.
dedicate all my life to this. This is an aspect of bringing forth human beings, all of us, forward.
We're doing it for nothing. You know, we're not being paid
No,
for
absolutely.
being here
But the
tonight.
point is that
We
if
do it
we
out of the
don't-
passion and the belief that we have.
I think there is a very important point that we've got to stress. That we live on a very special planet. Life is very special indeed. And I think it's time that we realize that if we wish to travel in space, which I'm sure a lot of people would like us to do, thinking long term, surely we will travel. We can't expect to go without emulating the conditions that we enjoy when we're living on the planet. In other words, our craft that we travel in have got to be more like UFOs with a very sophisticated technology for propulsion and protection with shields and radiation protection. The galactic cosmic radiation is lethal. You have to have a craft that can carry the required protection and have the thrusting capabilities. We won't be, in 1,000 years from now, going elsewhere in space in steam-driven rocket ships. We will be going in much more sophisticated craft using different types of technology that work harmoniously, gravity propulsion devices rather than crude rocket ships. And these devices will have to give us the protection. So one thing that we've learnt out of all this is that we're actually trapped on this planet. Forget about going to Mars and coming back alive, because we are going to be in space for a long time. We cannot travel in space out beyond the Van Allen belt without the right craft. This is where the energy must be placed. If NASA want to know what to do next, maybe respectfully we should suggest to them they start looking at advanced technologies with gravity propulsion devices that protect their astronauts.
And if your photographs are proved beyond doubt to be true, your research is proved beyond doubt to be true, you're sitting on a gold mine here, bigger than
Why?
Watergate.
Well, I don't think it's a
think
gold
so.
mine. We're not interested in the money.
Money.
We're interested in the advancement of humankind. We're interested in the progress of us all as the people of this planet. We don't want to be fobbed off with excuses and reasons why or evidence that is cooked. We want to really go to these places. We want to be proud of our achievements, not hide behind fakes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've been fed this information, we've believed it, and when you, having spent 25, 30 years believing something, find that what you believed wasn't the truth, you get angry.
Yes.
First of all, you get angry with yourself for being conned. Nobody likes to be conned. Nobody likes to feel that they've been manipulated. Everybody likes to feel that they're master of their own destiny. You suddenly find that one of the major events of the 20th century or any century is not actually what it would have appeared to have been when we were told about it. So you think, well, if that was wrong, what else is wrong? And you then dismantle the whole of one's belief, of your belief system, and you start building it back up again. I'm quite often asked, do I believe in UFOs? And my answer is always the same. It's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. And this is what David has done, what we're doing here tonight. We're looking at the evidence.
I think that's
Don't believe
thing.
what we say.
Because we've touched on a lot of things tonight, like ETs, UFOs, but throw all that away, because to some people that biases them against it and they all think we're all cranks. The fact is that the evidence is there in the photographs. That we have not been told the true story. What the exact true story is, we'll never agree, but the evidence is there for all to see, not just people with what others might call cranky belief systems. And it's up to people to take themselves to the photographs and see for themselves what people like David and Mary and the rest of us are saying.